Welcome to The Sound of Economics, the podcast series by Bruegel, the Brussels-based economic think tank. I'm Giuseppe Porcaro, and today we are discussing automation and the future of work. Here at Bruegel, we are undergoing a research project on the future of work and inclusive growth in Europe. The project analyzes the impact of technology on the nature, quantity, and quality of work, welfare systems, and inclusive growth at large. The Sound of Economics is proud to contribute to the project with a space for discussion and analysis on this theme. And as with the other episodes of this series, I'm accompanied by Laura Nursky, who is a Bruegel Fellow and one of the researchers at the core of the project. Hi, Laura. How are you?
Hi, Giuseppe. I'm very well, thank you.
And today we will explore the issue of automation through the lenses of the international political economy and why and if this really matters for the future of work. It is quite a broad and ambitious scope for this episode, and for this reason, I'm really happy to have with us Aaron Benanav from the Humboldt University of Berlin and Alexis Moraitis from the Lancaster University. Hi, Aaron. Hi, Alexis.
Hi. Thanks so much for having us.
Hi, hello. Thank you very much for having us.
Aaron, I would like to start with you. You have recently published a book, Automation and the Future of Work, that reads as a critique of both the overly enthusiastic voices, let's say the academic literature, policy and corporate discourse, which thinks that technology can bring us a better world of full automation and post-scarcity, as well critical of those with a Luddite attitude that see technological advance as the cause of job losses and many other things, including the end of civilizations as we know it. You argue that the crisis of work is not caused by automation per se, but rather by the stagnation of the global capitalist economy. And in order to do so, you delve into the past 70 years of economic history. Could you explain to us and to our listeners, in a summarized version, I know that that's very challenging, how do you reach this conclusion?
Great. Yeah. So I'll try to put the point succinctly. I think that the interest in automation today has a real cause. Like there's a real reason why people are worried, which is to do with the job market. There just aren't enough jobs. Many people are precarious. They face extreme forms of employment insecurity. We live in a time of rising inequality, economically speaking, and so on. And the claim of the automation theorists who I study, or the automation discourse that I read in the book, is that there's a direct connection between new technologies that are coming online today, advanced robotics, artificial intelligence, and so on, and these disturbing trends in the labor market. What I show in the book, very simply, is just that the automation theorists read the labor market trends the wrong way around. If they were right, then what we would be seeing would be very high rates of labor productivity and a very rapid destruction of jobs. People would be losing their jobs much more quickly than they had in the past. That's not true. Actually, we live in a time of very low rates of labor productivity growth. The economy is increasingly stagnant, and that is the real reason why it's so hard for people to find or keep their work today. The real problem is, in a sense, that jobs are being created much more slowly than they were in the past, not that the jobs are being destroyed much more quickly than they were in the past. And that's also why a lot of the problems, especially in Europe, concern not people who've been in secure jobs for a long time. They are losing their jobs, to be sure. The real problem focuses on labor market entrants, people who are trying to get jobs in a very slow growing economy. So I say the automation theorists have the right concern, i.e. they're concerned with these disturbing labor market trends, but they've got the cause backward. It's not speeding up or accelerating technological change. It's a slowdown in the rate of growth. That's the real cause.
Thank you. And Alexis, you've been reviewing the book of Aaron very recently, and perhaps you would like to add something to this first overview that Aaron just provided us.
Yeah, indeed. We wrote a review with my colleague and friend Jack Copley from the University of Bath, and I think I'm also speaking for my co-author when saying that Aaron's account is a very powerful one and one that is very hard to fault, and it is, I think, impossible. It's one of these accounts that change the terms of the debate, and it's impossible not to engage with this problem of stagnation in generating low labor demand, etc., when analyzing the future of work and the state of the global economy. In general, what I would like to draw attention to is also to the fact that the contemporary economic slowdown for us can be also be attributed to capitalism's runaway productivity growth logic. So essentially, it can be traced back to capitalism's inherent drive to ceaselessly augment productivity. And ultimately, in the long term, this drive to augment productivity undermines economic dynamism. So market competition generate pressures to increase productivity, to produce more in less time. So firms can, offer competitively priced goods on the market and, be profitable. And as a result of these competitive pressures, the capitalist economy has this capacity to generate impressive increases in the material output, in the useful goods and services that can be consumed. But even though it increases all this material output, let's say, what matters for individual firms is not how much material output they can produce, but how much revenue they can generate from it. And in the long run, productivity tends to paradoxically undermine firms' capacity to secure steady revenues. So schematically, we can see the consequences, let's say, of too much productivity in 3 steps. First, the more productivity develops, it cheapens goods, and in the long run, not immediately, but in the long run, it squeezes the profit contained in each good. So as a result, firms must sell more and more just to remain as profitable as before. And this leads to another problem, which is, the problem of overcapacities, industrial overcapacities that Aaron, describes excellently in his book. And, these overcapacities lock firms in tight markets where they are intensely competing for a market that simply does not grow fast enough. And this, disincentivizes further investment, leads to stagnation, etc. So essentially, material production, so the production of goods and services, even if it becomes more and more productive, it ceases to be profitable. And this leads to a third step, which is that firms have to simply invent new ways to secure profit shares, to secure revenues. And they can do this by investing more in financial assets, undergoing mergers and acquisitions to expand their reach, or capitalizing on intellectual property rents to monopolize the market. But all these strategies, what they do inadvertently is that they further entrench stagnation. And I think that ultimately all this spiral of overcapacities, stagnation, etc., can be traced back to the logic of augmenting productivity ceaselessly. And I think that this is important because, many of the mainstream debates that we see and the debates in, international organizations, etc., they focus on how to remedy stagnation by boosting productivity, how to solve the productivity puzzle. But if indeed productivity growth is at the source of all this waning dynamism, then, by solving the productivity puzzle, we might, in the short run, revive growth, but in the long run, we might still be stuck, locked into a stagnant economy.
Laura, you might have a comment on all this.
Yes, I was just thinking which one to start with because so many interesting points have been raised already. But I wanted to go back to the introduction that Aaron made when he was arguing that the labor market struggles we see today do not originate from automation per se, but from the declining productivity growth and declining output growth. And as Alexis commented on that in the book, Aaron makes the link to the problem of industrial overcapacity. So oversaturated markets internationally in manufacturing. I just wanted to ask Aaron if he can go a bit deeper into this problem, explaining it to us, and then also sharing his thoughts on why markets cannot solve this problem. So why can't firms just disinvest from these oversaturated markets, find new markets to invest in? Okay, I'll leave it at that, and then maybe follow up with another question.
Great. Yeah, I think that's a really important question, and I have an answer to it, I guess, that I'm proposing. But I should say it's a very big and open debate about why this is happening. I don't feel like, in any sense, it's a settled debate. So my account sort of combines the tendencies that Alexis was describing with a kind of geographic story as well. I think that it's not only about this drive to expand production in any one country, but also about the way the kind of leakage, as it were, or spread of technological capacities and productive capacities across the world. So one thing that I point out in the book is that overproduction, overcapacity is far worse in agriculture than it is in industry. We've lived through this period that we've been talking about the last 70 years, have seen an incredible industrialization of agriculture and the replacement of many agricultural industrial products with synthetic alternatives. And what that's meant is that prices, not steadily, there are these big super cycles of commodity price booms, but over the last 70 years, the general trend has been towards really extreme overcapacity in agriculture. And what that's meant is that any country that wants to remain connected to the world market has had to find a place for itself, has had to try to make space in industrial markets. So on the one hand, the story I tell is a story about how the biggest firms in the US over the course of the 60s and 70s faced increasing competition from major competitors in Germany and Japan. This was really different from what economists had thought would happen because they thought there would be a lot of complementarity between different, that firms would specialize in very different types of products. In fact, what we saw was increasing global redundancy. Firms competing in the same sorts of products, especially around wages and productivity levels and currency valuations coming to play there. And even as that competition started to really intensify in the 60s, late 60s and 70s, what we saw was that even more entrants piled in. South Korea and Taiwan, famously, first of all, in the 60s and 70s and 80s. But then increasingly, every country in the world was trying to find some place for itself in these large global supply chains. So I think the tendency has been not just towards a kind of initial onset of overcapacity, which had knock-on effects in terms of slowing growth of consumer demand in these countries. As growth slows down, there's less spending to be done as well, and that's certainly an important part of the story. But on the whole, more and more firms in more and more countries continue to pile into these manufacturing markets. Some people say, "Oh, well, why don't firms move into services?" Services make up about 5% of global trade. There's really no space there for countries to move into. And the truth is that there's just a limited number of product markets globally, and all of these firms, supported by industrial policies across many states, are just piling into those product lines in order to find a space for themselves. And some of the newer product lines. Now, there's actually quite there's a kind of super cycle going on right now with semiconductors, right? But many of the products that use computer chips, like LCD TV screens and all kinds of other consumer electronics, are some of the lines facing the most overcapacity globally. So it's totally true that companies should be disinvesting from these lines and moving elsewhere. The truth is that there aren't very many other places to go. And that's why it makes sense for a lot of companies to stay, especially if they have intangibles, if they have brands, if they have if they have already sunk fixed capital in the line. There's a lot of reasons to remain. And even as old capital is kind of depreciates and is thrown out, ever more is constantly entering from these other countries. So I think it's kind of to my mind, it's both a kind of deep, dynamic story that Alexis is telling, and crucially, a kind of global story about the entry of all of these countries trying to get a piece of that dynamic growth possibilities in manufacturing, and facing what economists sometimes call a fallacy of composition. There may be some space in the market, but when firms from all over the world try to enter that space at the same time, and we have competition among high-income countries with one another at the height of these, value chains, as well as at the mid-level and the low level, all of these competitors piling in. And yeah, the result is very slow growth, and a condition in which some countries have been able to grow quickly only when the whole market is only growing at about 2% per year, let's say industrial output globally. If your country is going to see 5 or 6 or 10% growth, it's going to be because you're taking market share away from other countries. And that's why we have this incredibly intense competitive environment with very few alternatives. I think often people do say, like, why don't they move into tradable services? But it's just such a tiny market, and it's mostly financial services, and it's limited to the wealthiest countries. Of course, tourism as well, but then you're talking about some very specific, geographic, locational advantages that a lot of countries don't have.
I'm a bit confused when I hear you and Alexis talking about this increased competition as if that's a given across all markets. Well, actually, I've been reading the opposite as well. Increased concentration in many markets. If you think about big tech, pharma, we just see a handful of players who are well capable of ensuring their profits and are not squeezed at all.
I think that's totally true. And I think that the strategy on the part of the largest firms over this whole period has been to retreat to the top of the value chains and to allow medium-sized companies to compete for scraps, basically. So we definitely see this kind of almost dualization in the markets with retreat to the high end where possible. And then, with many other players trying to act as suppliers. I think the thing that we've seen, especially like talk about German auto companies and so on, is just that when you retreat to the top of the value chain like that, you just don't end up producing many jobs anymore. And so I think that's one of the reasons why we've seen these companies have really been able to secure their position in the market, but in a way that ends up not really being growth enhancing for the wider society in the way that earlier waves of kind of shared growth did create those kinds of dynamics.
Yeah, I think that's an absolutely essential point about the rising concentration in certain sectors of economic activities, and I think that we can see also that as a result precisely of this, intense competition and overcapacities that we witness, for instance, in manufacturing, because essentially the alternative, to competing in overcrowded industrial markets is to basically take advantage of all this intangible capital, of all these, trademarks, copyrights, and intellectual property rights in general that allow you to get a great share of profits without essentially being drawn into this, intense competition in manufacturing markets. So essentially, like many, big tech firms, etc., they have offshored the dirty work of competing in industrial markets, and they focus on what they specialized in, knowledge, intangible capital, and to the extent that they are the firms that make the most profit in the economy. There is a lot of research going on right now that shows basically how completely bifurcated is the corporate world, because you have, on the one hand, those that struggle to get a share of profits in overcrowded markets, and then you have these big tech software firms or pharmaceutical firms that basically are able to extract rents essentially without being drawn into this competitive environment. So, but again, I think that it can be seen as a way also to escape from the competitive pressure. So I don't think that it is completely disconnected from intense competition elsewhere. It is a strategy almost to find alternative ways to secure revenues, I think.
Great. Aaron, if we move back to the problem of slowing output growth that you attribute to the deindustrialization and the transition to services, you argue in the book also that another problem is that it's harder in services to realize productivity increases, right? Which then, as the economy transitions to services, this leads to a slower overall growth of the economy, and then less growth in jobs and employment. Now, with the ascent of AI, which is something we are studying in the project at Bruegel, we now actually see many productivity increasing applications of AI, especially in retail, hospitality, customer service, if you think about chatbots and things like that. So do you think that the automation theorist holds some merit when it comes to specifically the use of AI, as opposed to these more mechanical forms of automation that we saw before?
It's a really interesting question, right? And I think that there's a few reasons to be skeptical that these technologies will generate as many gains as the boosters are suggesting. That is to say, the extent to which it'll be possible to generalize them across the economy. One thing that I often point out is that the 2010s were the decade that we're supposed to see, amazing gains in productivity from all of these computer technologies being implemented in the service sector. And yet, just looking back at the decade, we now, since it's come to a close, we can see that it was the worst decade for productivity growth across the American economy and across the OECD since they started recording numbers in the 1950s and 60s, basically. So I think that we've seen here. I tend to agree, maybe not about the causes, but about the general story that Northwestern economist Robert Gordon tells when he points out that already in the 80s, there were claims about how much computer technologies like the fax machine and, digital phones and Xeroxes, all of these digital technologies already for decades, there's been major claims about how many gains they're going to generate in terms of productivity in the service sector. And yet, on the whole, what we've seen is just this long-term slowdown in productivity growth. Someone online was making fun of Paul Krugman for saying the internet won't, in 1995, he said, the internet won't deliver productivity gains. And, this prediction, that it will be worse or something than the fax machine. And people were making fun of Krugman for saying this. And of course, it does seem like such a joke. Our lives have been so digitized. But I just went back and checked to make sure. But it's hilarious to see that actually the economy saw much higher productivity gains during the era of the fax machine than it has during the age of the internet. And of course, this is the famous productivity paradox that computers are everywhere, but in the productivity statistics. And is that to say that necessarily these technologies, AI, narrow AI, so-called narrow AI of machine learning and deep learning and neural networks won't deliver these gains in the future? They might. It's hard. It's very hard to say. But I think looking at the past should at least make us skeptical that the gains will be as generalizable as has been claimed. And I think what you're starting to see in the last few years, especially in the work of NYU psychologist Gary Marcus, as well as among even some machine learning researchers at MIT and even at Google is an admittance that there might actually be limits to what machine learning can achieve. These technologies are in no way bringing us closer to general artificial intelligence, and it might be very difficult to get the success rate for these machines above 95%, which would make it very hard for them to handle critical tasks, essentially. Not that human beings don't make mistakes, but a lot of the productivity gains claimed for these things depended on them being able to use more and more processing power to get closer and closer to 100% accuracy. So those are just some reasons to be skeptical. But look, the past is an imperfect guide to the future. It always could happen. At any moment, the big breakthrough could come and we could get to some real general artificial intelligence. When I look at the research that's being done right now, people generally who've really studied the problem say we're at least 50 to 100 years away from that. And that's as good as saying we've made basically no additional progress down that road. So those are just some reasons to be skeptical, but it's also very fun to think about the possibilities of the world. That those kind of technologies, were they to come into play, might make possible.
If I may add something here, or rather a comment which bridges to. Going back to the question of the future work, I'm also pretty, I wouldn't say skeptical, but pretty much share your opinion, Aaron, that for the time being, we are not in the moment where AI is replacing completely the work of humans. And that gets back to the issue of the impact of automation, because on the other hand, going from the macro perspective, which we tried to bridge now in the first part of our conversation, going down to the effects of automation on work, we can't deny that there is a change on the way workers are performing their duties, their tasks, and the way some AI supported technology could, either make it worse, like scheduling algorithms in platform work or warehouses, biometric monitoring of workers, or other forms of algorithmic management, or could alternatively, being more on the empowering side. There is we recently had another podcast with Laura speaking about skills and how technology could lead to reskilling or de-skilling or something like that. How do you see the interplay between automation, job quality, and labor demand playing out in the future? On let's say in the scenario that AI will keep increasing, will keep improving, but we are not in the scenario yet of a general AI which will be fully automating everything that humans are doing at the moment.
Yeah, I think I should stress as well, I'm not saying that there's no more productivity growth or that, technologies aren't changing work and in fact making workers more efficient. That's totally still happening, right? And it's happening in all different ways in the economy. The specific claim, and I think sometimes I really should do more to reemphasize this. The specific claim I'm making is that the speed at which those changes are happening has been slowing down. It's not that it's not happening anymore. It's just happening at a slower pace than in the past. And so it can't be it's not the case. We couldn't argue that there's some qualitative breakthrough that's suddenly accelerating the pace of productivity growth. That's the source of the jobs problem today. That's kind of the core question or research impetus for my work. That said, as you mentioned, it's really important that those changes are happening and they're changing people's experiences of work and they're changing the kinds of jobs that are being created today. And one thing I really focus on in the book, and I wish I had even focused on it more, is the way that in an environment of general insecurity for workers, especially in European countries where changes in labor law have made for more flexible so-called labor markets, where it's much easier to hire workers on fixed or temporary contracts, and with all kinds of making it much easier to fire workers and to hire them, through long supply, through various kinds of subcontracting systems. That's a general condition of insecurity, and then it affects the kinds of jobs that are being created. So obviously the platform economy is a huge part of this story. And I think, in some ways, the term digital Taylorism is a really interesting one to think about what's going on today. On the one hand, we think of like Frederick Taylor, an idea of scientific management. In some ways, digital technologies allow an even greater degree of surveillance of workers. And we saw, jobs in Amazon warehouses aren't about to disappear. Instead, Amazon is patenting all of these additional tools for closely watching and measuring the work that workers are doing and how many seconds they're taking to move between different tasks. So you have extreme forms of surveillance. And as those are implemented across the economy as a kind of cost control measures, those are the kind of things that make work terrible. Anybody knows that the less freedom you have to carry out your job the way you want to, the harder it is to get up and get through the workday. And those technologies sometimes have paradoxical consequences for labor productivity, because precisely they allow a much greater degree of measurement, but they also sap the will of workers in ways that can be very destructive for them. So on the one hand, that's a kind of increase in the Taylorization of the process. On the other hand, we see ways that these new technologies have an almost anti-Taylorist kind of function, because they often remove layers of middle management from these processes. So Uber, for example, hires very few or no real middle managers to watch over its workers. It relies on algorithms to do that work. So I'm not going to sit here and I'm not a doomer about all technology. I think, as you mentioned at the beginning of the show, I'm not saying that all of these digital technologies are being used in ways that make people's work worse. A lot of these technologies are going to, especially forms of narrow AI, like translation apps and all of these different design tools, are certainly going to also make certain people's work, remove some of the drudgery or the least interesting tasks of that work. And we also know that these technologies could be used in all kinds of ways that connect workers, make it easier for them to communicate with others, other workers, that improve the kind of horizontal and solidarity links that workers share with one another. So these technologies are very complicated in their effects. My concern is that in an environment of economic slowdown, where employers are paying less attention to their workers' needs, a lot of those technologies are going to be used in ways that make working conditions worse, precisely because when workers are weak, when their bargaining power is weak, employers don't pay as much attention to their needs in making investments. So that's my concern there. Sorry to go on for a long time about that. It's a very complicated topic, and I should say it's something that there are so many researchers working on right now. There's a lot of really interesting work being done on digital technologies and the transformation of the work today. It's a really exciting field.
Yes. So regarding also what Laura raised earlier about the possibility of increasing productivity in services, etc. And there is a passage from the political economist Joseph Schumpeter in his book Capitalism, Socialism and Democracy that is very relevant to our discussion. And basically what he says is, technological possibilities are an uncharted sea, and he makes this claim, in relation to the stagnationist arguments of his era of the 30s, etc. And essentially, I'm more or less quoting now. What he says is that it is impossible to predict a slackening of output due to the exhaustion of technological possibilities. And I think that this quote has some merit to it, in the sense that it's true that we cannot predict the future of technological development. If we take a look at the historical evolution of manufacturing as well as of agriculture that Aaron mentioned, in their infancy, these sectors were not the high productivity sectors that we now know. Like, they had real difficulties in technical difficulties in augmenting productivity, both, goods production, both manufacturing and especially agriculture, because of its dependence on, natural sources of energy, etc., etc. So technological progress, scientific progress allowed the overcoming of the barriers that inhibited the growth of output in these sectors. And I think that, we can't, say for sure what is going to happen in the service sector. In fact, there are indications that some not only routine but other kind of activities that require, higher intelligence and emotional skills, communicative skills, etc., could be potentially replaced by robots endowed with artificial intelligence. The tradability of services could also be helped through, increased, digital technologies, etc. I don't know. Now, in education, for instance, you have these massive open online courses, which, essentially allow you to reach a global market. You don't need the classroom anymore to teach. So there are possibilities. There are some indications that show that, we can overcome the technical barriers to productivity growth. The big question is even if we manage to overcome these technical barriers, what is it that tells us that we're not going to get stuck again into the cycle of overcapacities and stagnation that, industrial markets, for example, face? And I think that, we could even say that, services that will see their productivity increase through artificial intelligence, etc., might get stuck in a dynamic similar to manufacturing, essentially. And then that will mean that, as they stagnate, their contribution to economic growth will falter, and people will have to find jobs elsewhere that are, in the non-automated sector. So regardless of sectors, I think that we can, there are possibilities that this cycle of, stagnation, overcapacities and stagnation can repeat itself. And that's the experience we have of every sector, both agriculture and manufacturing. So perhaps there are deep tendencies within, capitalist production that push towards these, overcapacities and overproduction.
Okay, great. I think we are reaching the end, and I wanted to ask one more question. Aaron, I was happy to hear you say that you are not a technology doomsayer, or you don't take a defeatist view of technological development. I think that's great. I also believe that we have a power as a society to shape the direction that technology is taking. So I wanted to talk to you about this concept of directing technological change. And as you argue in the book, technological change is not socially neutral, or it's not driven by accidental discoveries, scientific discoveries by researchers in white lab coats, but instead R&D is driven by profit incentives, especially for labor replacing technologies in a capitalist society. So I have a dual question for you. How would a post-capitalist society organize its R&D to steer technological change in a welfare-enhancing direction? But maybe more relevant for today is, how can we just alter the incentives in a capitalist society in order to steer technological change in a direction that's inclusive to everyone and welfare-enhancing?
Great. Yeah. Well, I'll handle the second part of that question first, because I think we live in an interesting time where the pendulum is swinging back. In the 80s and 90s, everyone felt really convinced that, in fact, as Friedrich Hayek said, the market is a discovery process or competition is a discovery process that, really the market is what's going to generate all of the innovations that are going to change our world. And it's only very recently in the work of people like Bill Lazonick, who's been talking about it for a long time, but also Mariana Mazzucato on the entrepreneurial state, that people are starting to remember that, in fact, a lot of the big innovations that have changed our world have come about through public investment and public support, basically, for research and development. So we live in a time where, unlike in the 80s and 90s, there's a return of interest in something like industrial policy, which is the word that's how in the West, that's the word they use when they mean planning. They don't want to talk about planning because that's something people do in the East. That's 5-year plans. In the West, they call it industrial planning, industrial policy. Whoa, they wouldn't call it industrial planning. So that, I think that's a really important change. And it's really important to remember that markets, for a lot of reasons, essentially, it's very hard to capture all of the gains of basic research. A lot of it goes nowhere. And so markets just aren't that good at supporting it. And we need a lot of public support. And universities, of course, are very involved in that too, to generate R&D. I think my claim, which I'm working on now in a sequel to the automation book, is that the thing that capitalism really underrates are what I might call production neutral investments. So, for example, if you have a workplace, you as a society, we might want to invest in making workers enjoy their work more, get more satisfaction out of their work, even if it has no consequences for how much that workplace produces. Those are the kinds of investments that a capitalist society will leave on the table, right? Enhancements in worker satisfaction that have no effect on productive capacity. Obviously, besides worker satisfaction, the other really big example of this is ecology. Unless capitalists are forced to take into account costs of environmental damage through a variety of, regulations and taxes, they just will not make investments that don't destroy the environment, let alone investments that actually would enhance the natural environment around industry. So I think that in a post-capitalist society that isn't geared toward profitability, we'd see a major expansion in the space for these kinds of or production neutral investments that look at a huge range of things that are massively important for human well-being, job satisfaction, urban environments, public health, and sustainability, and so on. All of these kinds of major features of our actual experience of the world, our life, our possibilities, should be much greater focus, both for research and development and for investment in our society. And that's just not going to happen in a world that's geared toward profitable investment. And we're starting to see some indication of that now. We live in, another sign of stagnation is just incredibly low long-term interest rates bottoming out. Really, money is there to be used. And we're starting to see states trying or indicating that they might take advantage of that to maybe start to deal with this incredible, scary climate crisis that is already starting to show massive effects on the environment. Those are a lot of those investments to get us out of this danger with respect to the climate are going to have to be production neutral investments that just enhance well-being of human beings and of the environment without increasing our productive capacity. So that's at least a little pitch I would give for thinking about R&D investment and post-capitalism.
Yes. I think that Aaron just raised some fundamental points, and what I would like to add is that the debates that we have on the future impact of technological change on human life and human society in general, etc., reveals something profoundly wrong about the way we relate to technology. Technological change appears to be completely autonomous. It appears as being directed by, suprahuman forces and imposed on society. And at the same time, technology is obviously a social creation. It's not God-given. We create it. So something that is completely a human creature appears as a force that cannot be tamed, and that might or might not, cause great harm and disruptions to workers, to people. So I think that to consciously steer technological change in a welfare-enhancing direction, as you said, Laura, I think that we need to try to discern the sources of this alienation, of this situation where we as a society create technology yet are unable to fully control its impact upon people. And within the context of the capitalist market, the diffusion of new technologies occurs in a spontaneous and decentralized manner, as no one is really in charge of it, right? Firms adopt new technologies to beat competition or simply to avoid bankruptcy. So technological adaptation is a pure necessity in a system where, securing profits is the only way to survive for firms. So to render technology fully under, social and human control, I think that we must question some fundamental principles about the way we organize our economy. In the economy we live, the decisions about the future of technological change, etc., are delegated to the market. The implementation of new technologies simply reflects, cost and profit incentives. If it costs less to employ new technology than to hire people, I'll employ that technology and people will be, unemployed. Or if labor is very, very cheap, well, I might not invest at all in new technologies because I can, exploit a very cheap workforce. So I think ultimately it comes up to a question of whether investment and production decisions are to be left completely in the hands of an anonymous market, or whether we must introduce more democratic decision-making processes regarding what, how, and when to produce at all, rather than technological necessity being a necessity. And in this way, we might have more social control over where technology goes, what it does, and the kind of problems we want to solve with it, whether it is the climate crisis or other problems.
Great. I think my final comment would be that I'm looking forward very much to the sequel that Aaron just described to us. I agree a lot with the analogy of equating, or the idea of environmental externalities, equating that idea to the externalities that arise from bad quality jobs on the pool of human capital that we have. And both of those are a tragedy of the commons. In the case of the environment, it's literally a commons, but the pool of human capital is in the same sense a commons that is at risk for a big tragedy. And like we have a carbon tax, we could think of having some sort of a burnout tax, right? That taxes companies or corporations for organizing work in a bad way and having bad quality jobs leading to burnout, which comes with high costs for society as well. So Aaron, I'm looking forward to your book. Please send it our way when it comes out. And thank you for being here with us today.
And I would like to thank everyone as well from my side, Aaron, Alexis, and Laura. This brings us to the end of this episode. And I want to remind our listeners that this episode was linked to the research project at Bruegel on future work and inclusive growth in Europe. The Sound of Economics will keep following the project, and there will be more episodes dedicated to the theme to come. And as usual, you can read in open access all the analysis by our scholars on our website, www.bruegel.org. Thanks a lot for joining the Sound of Economics. Until next time, bye-bye.